The Sega Saturn should have been Sega's future. Instead, it became the beginning of the end. And more than 2 decades later, the Saturn is still remembered as one of the most fascinating failures in gaming history. Not because it was weak, not because it lacked ambition, but because it arrived at the exact moment the gaming industry was changing forever, and Sega made one critical mistake after another trying to keep up. By the mid-1990s, Sega was riding high. The Genesis had turned Sega into a global gaming giant. Sonic the Hedgehog became one of the most recognizable characters in the world. And for a brief moment, Sega genuinely challenged Nintendo's dominance. But success can create pressure. And Sega now faced a terrifying problem. The future of gaming was changing faster than anyone expected. Arcades were fading, CD technology was rising, and most importantly, 3D graphics were becoming the next revolution. The entire industry knew it. The only question was who would adapt first. Sony entered the market with the PlayStation, Nintendo prepared the Nintendo 64, and Sega rushed to build the Saturn. Now pause here, because this next decision changed everything. Originally, the Saturn was designed primarily for powerful 2D gaming. And honestly, that made sense at the time. Sega dominated arcades, 2D fighting games and sprite-based experiences were still hugely popular. But suddenly, Sony revealed the PlayStation, and its focus on 3D gaming shocked the industry. Sega panicked. Instead of redesigning the Saturn cleanly, they rapidly added extra processors to boost 3D performance. On paper, this sounded smart. In reality, it created one of the most complicated console architectures developers had ever seen. And that complexity would haunt Saturn for its entire life. When the Sega Saturn launched in Japan in 1994, the early response was actually strong, especially for arcade-style games. Players loved titles that recreated Sega's arcade experiences at home. The console felt powerful, advanced, and exciting. But in North America, things went very differently. At the first Electronic Entertainment Expo in 1995, Sony announced the PlayStation price, $299, simple, direct, aggressive. Meanwhile, Sega shocked retailers and consumers by launching the Saturn early without warning. Many stores weren't prepared, developers weren't ready, and some retailers were furious for being excluded from the launch entirely. It created confusion immediately, and confusion is dangerous in a console war. The Saturn wasn't just competing against Nintendo anymore, it was now fighting Sony, a company entering gaming with massive momentum and a much easier platform for developers. And this became Saturn's biggest problem, not power, not design, but complexity. Developers struggled to understand the hardware. Creating games for the Saturn was difficult and time-consuming. Meanwhile, the PlayStation's architecture was far easier to work with. So naturally, more developers moved towards Sony. But despite all these problems, Saturn still produced unforgettable games. And for many players, its library remains deeply underrated. Let's quickly look at 3 of the most played and beloved Saturn titles. First, Virtua Fighter 2. This game stunned players with smooth animation and impressive 3D fighting mechanics. Fans loved its technical gameplay and arcade-perfect feel. Second, Nights into Dreams. A colorful, dreamlike experience unlike almost anything else at the time. Players loved the creativity, music, and strange atmosphere. Third, Sega Rally Championship. Fast, exciting, and incredibly replayable. Players loved the sense of speed and arcade-style racing action. And honestly, that's what Saturn represented best. Arcade energy, fast gameplay, unique creativity. The console had personality. But personality alone wasn't enough to survive the mid-1990s gaming revolution. Because this era wasn't just about games anymore. It was about accessibility, developer support, and 3D innovation. And Sony was winning all 3. Now here's the part many people forget. The Sega Saturn wasn't actually weak. In some situations, it was extremely powerful, especially for 2D graphics. Many fighting games looked incredible on the system. But because developers struggled with the architecture, the hardware's full potential often went unused. And perception matters. Players started seeing the PlayStation as the future, while the Saturn slowly looked outdated. Meanwhile, Sega itself was becoming fragmented internally. Sega Japan and Sega America often disagreed on strategy. Hardware decisions became inconsistent, marketing lacked clarity, and consumer trust slowly weakened. Because despite the Genesis success, Sega now faced another issue. Too many products, too many add-ons, too many confusing transitions. Players remembered the Sega CD, the 32X, and now Saturn. Some consumers no longer knew where Sega was heading, and uncertainty hurts momentum. But perhaps the biggest challenge came from timing itself. The Saturn arrived during one of the fastest technological shifts in gaming history. 2D was fading, 3D worlds were exploding in popularity, and Sony captured the excitement of that transition perfectly. The PlayStation didn't just feel new, it felt inevitable. Saturn struggled to maintain momentum outside Japan. Sales slowed, developer support weakened, and eventually, Sega found itself fighting a battle it could no longer win. But despite all this, Saturn still had loyal fans. And even today, many collectors and retro gamers view it as one of the most unique consoles ever made, because beneath its problems, there was creativity, experimentation, and games that felt genuinely different. Still, the Saturn had major flaws that held it back, and 3 stood out more than anything else. First, its incredibly complex hardware. Developers struggled to optimize games efficiently. This limited third-party support and slowed software development. Second, poor timing and rushed launch decisions. The surprise early release confused retailers and damaged relationships with stores and developers. Third, weak 3D performance perception compared to PlayStation. Even though the hardware was capable in certain areas, Sony's simpler architecture gave the PlayStation stronger and more consistent 3D experiences. And yet, despite these flaws, Saturn remains historically important because it represents a turning point, a moment when gaming shifted permanently into the 3D era, and Sega, for the first time, started losing control of the future. Looking back now, the Sega Saturn feels deeply nostalgic. The futuristic startup screen, the strange controller shape, the bold arcade energy, and the feeling of a company trying desperately to stay ahead in a rapidly changing world. For many players, the Saturn wasn't just a console. It was the final chapter of Sega's experimental spirit before everything changed. Because after Saturn, Sega would only have one more chance, the Dreamcast. And the stakes would become even higher. The Sega Saturn didn't dominate the industry, it didn't win the console war, and commercially, it struggled badly, but its story remains unforgettable, because sometimes the most fascinating consoles aren't the biggest successes. They are the ones caught in the middle of history changing around them. The Sega Saturn wasn't just a console, it was Sega fighting to survive the future, and unfortunately, the future moved faster than Sega expected.